this month, but next month we'll be donating foods to Carroll Food Sunday as part of the program for the BLT. So keep that in mind. You can bring those items here if you'd like. We have a calendar chock full of amazing programs and events. Pick up one of the flyers on your way out. Tonight, we have one of our Carroll 250 Speaker Series events, Francis Scott Key, presented by Lou Giles in Exploration Commons. That's at 6:30, November 29th. Tease of the season. I can't believe this isn't sold out already, but we have quite a crowd attending that at Sunday morning at Savannah's in New Windsor, a new place that's open there. Again, that's November 29th. And then we probably should mention also December 11th, Owls of All Ages. Galen, you're in the room. If you want any information about Owls of All Ages at the Historical Society, you can see Galen. That on December 11th. It is going to be a holiday party with great friends, Owls of All Ages. So see Galen. You can come see me or Laura about that too. So please check out the Historical Society's website for upcoming events and programs. And also, let me just plug, we just launched the Historical Society's digital library. There's some tweaks that are happening with the digital library in terms of the search functionality, but it's up. It has some amazing resources on the digital library, including all of the yesteryear's columns from every decade. All of the Historical Society's journals are on the digital library. The Union Bridge pilot is all there. Also, the Carroll News is posted and other neat documents. So all word searchable, and the digital exhibits are on the digital library as well. And you can get to that by visiting the Historical's website. So it's my great honor to introduce Professor Robert Lemieux. He works at McDaniel College. He's professor of communication and cinema. And his creative endeavors include filmmaking and curating popular museum exhibitions. He has collaborated with some of America's most notable museums, including the National Gallery of Art, the Smithsonian Institution, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Ringling Circus Museum, and the Norman Rockwell Museum. He has wrapped up his project, Growing into Greatness, a documentary that focuses on national champion trees, which are the largest of their kind in the United States. And we have the great privilege of hearing about that now today with Robert. So thank you very much, and can we give him a round of applause?
Thank you, Jason. And thank you for being interested in this project. You know, when you tell people you're working on a documentary about trees, you're never really sure what kind of reaction you're going to get. But much to my surprise, every reaction has always been positive. And it's that sort of reinforcement, if you will, that just sort of keeps you chugging and chugging and chugging along in a project that took 18 months from probably start to finish. And so what I want to do today is talk a little bit about how you create a project of this sort, as well as, you know, the nature of the trees that we sort of took an interest in. Right? And so the first thing, you know, collaborative partners are important in an endeavor of this sort, and McDaniel College and Maryland Public Television. I've been working on a different project with Maryland Public Television that was kind of languishing, and I was getting the sense it was languishing, and it was primarily due to funding, not interest in the project. But I thought, maybe I need to pivot, so I approached them with this idea of national champion trees in Maryland. By the way, just as a tangent, I am stunned. There are 12 national champions here in Maryland, largest of their species in the U.S., which I would have never guessed. You know, I would have guessed that logging in the whatever decade you want to think about, 1840, 1880, 1920, I would have guessed that any tree of size or significance would have been long gone. But lo and behold, we have 12 here in the state of Maryland. Magnificent when you're standing next to them. And so I pitched this tree to Maryland this idea to Maryland Public Television, and much to my surprise, they were like, yeah, we're in, let's do this. And I don't own a production company, so McDaniel College served as essentially the production entity. And the film airs this Saturday, November 22nd at 8 p.m. And if you're a night owl or if you suffer from insomnia, I think it's also at 12 a.m. and 3 a.m. as well. Right? And as a side note, if your TV looks like that, it's probably time to upgrade, all right? So these are two obviously essential partners because MPT provides you with an outlet. I mean, you can create art, and filmmaking is an art form, but invariably the question arises, how are you getting this in front of an audience? So MPT is obviously critical to that. Money, also critical, right? And three sort of key funding sources here. Our own local Carroll County Arts Council, the Carroll County Chamber of Commerce, and then the Maryland State Arts Council. And just as a side story with the Maryland State Arts Council, I had received funding from them on, I think, two previous projects, two previous exhibits that I'd been involved in. And I wasn't certain how they treated film, because when I looked through the awards that they give, because they publish those, I had never seen a film. I thought, I'm not sure how this is going to go. And I was requesting the top dollar amount that they provide, $4,000. And didn't get funded. But you can request feedback, and they'll send you feedback, and they give you a score. And my score was 87 out of 100. And you can also request a conversation about the feedback you received. So I requested that. And over the course of the conversation, it became apparent that anything sort of 90 or above gets funded. So yeah, at 87, I was really close. And the other thing that became apparent was, well, not everybody who's reviewing these types of grants is familiar with film language. So flesh that out a little bit more. And if you had an outlet, that would certainly benefit you. And I said, well, I do have an outlet. It's Maryland Public Television. And they said, well, if they can provide a letter indicating that would be pivotal. And so I apply again. Next time around, I've scored somewhere in the 90s and received funding, which was obviously very helpful. And so, not to single them out, because the other two, our local arts council and the chamber, also pivotal to this as well. So how do you start a project like this? So this was 2015-ish. There's a master gardener in my neighborhood, no longer alive, Connie Hogue, who some of you may recall. And Connie was always fascinated with my yard, always showing up, giving me advice about trees and plants and so forth. And one day she shows up and she says, I want to measure, I think maybe I should measure your redbud tree to sort of see if it's a state or definitely maybe a county champion. And I was perplexed by that. And she went on to describe the Maryland Big Tree Program. And when we were done, I run in the house and I just Google it, and sure enough, up comes a website, fabulous website, by the way, detailing all the county, state, and national champions in Maryland, the specifics, the measurements, photos, everything. Amazing website. And I thought, wow, this would make for a great story, like a documentary of some sort. And that just sort of rolled around up here for the better part of a decade, because you have other projects you're working on, and slowly it bubbled to the top. And on the right is the redbud tree that she wanted to measure. And there's kind of a side alley to my property and then a back alley. And just as sort of a tangent, it used to be a little larger than this. There was a huge, kind of see in the center of the dark area, there was a huge piece that hung out over. One of the city trash trucks clipped it, and kerplunk, it came down into the alley. But the weird part is, it happened while I was away, while we were away, and I came home one weekend from being away and step out of the car, and there's all this like sawdust in the driveway. And I'm like looking around, and you could tell it had been swept as well. Like, what is going on? And then I look over at my redbud tree, and a huge piece of it is no longer there. So my first suspect was the city, because I'd seen their trucks in the alley before hitting a tree. And I called them that Monday morning, and they're like, oh, yeah, that was us. Sorry about that. We took out that. So I don't think, if you were to measure it today, I don't think it would come close to being a county or even a state champion for that matter. But that's what started all this. 2015, just a casual conversation with a master gardener about her interest in measuring a tree associated with the Maryland Big Tree Program. And then, as I say, it just rolled around and rolled around. How do we determine? How do we measure trees? Right? which I think is obviously pivotal here. Whether you're a national or a state or a county champion, one of the 3 measurements that they use to determine a national champion is we measure your circumference in inches at what they call breast height, 4.5 feet above ground level. They'll take a measurement of the trunk, the circumference in inches. They'll measure the height in feet using what they call a clinometer, which measures angles and so forth. And they measure that in feet. And then they'll also measure what they call crown spread, the 2 widest points. But they do it from orthogonal angles, so at right angles from each other. So they take 2 measurements, right? And they'll average those 2 measurements. And then they have a little simple mathematical formula. Let's add the height in feet plus the circumference in inches plus 25% of that average crown spread equals certain value, and that value becomes the point. And because it's standardized, and you can standardize that across any type of tree that's out there, you now have a standard measurement for determining point-wise whether a tree is a county, a state, or a national champion. Now, it might be the case that you have a monster tree in terms of crown spread, but maybe it lacks height, maybe it lacks circumference. Or maybe you have a huge circumference but lack height and lack crown spread. So you can sort of see how all 3 of these measurements come into play to determining a champion tree. And here is sort of a couple still images of the measurement process. And we decided to select one of the trees on the campus of McDaniel College. It's kind of framed rather nicely. It's an American elm, framed rather nicely at the end of the sidewalk in the arch. And the gentleman in the orange, his name is Gary Schwimmer. Gary is local. He works, or actually volunteers, for the Maryland Big Tree program, and he goes throughout the state measuring trees. And when I contacted him about measuring, because we wanted to film the measurement process, when I contacted him, he said, well, let's do it at McDaniel, because they have a number of trees. And then the gentleman on the right, Patrick, he was an intern with the local forestry board here. And so they, in the film, run us through that process of how a tree is measured. And much to our surprise, we didn't realize it, but when they're done measuring this tree, it was large enough to be a county champion. So it's kind of a nice little element surprise to the film. This is their website. I would bring it up if I could, but I would highly recommend, and it is very simply Maryland Big Trees. It's a rabbit hole, so I'll warn you, because it's so well laid out with and you can ask for certain aspects. I just want to look at American elms. It'll show you American elms. Or I just want to look at state champs. It'll show you state champs. And then it gives you like the Latin name, the height, where it's located, even photos associated with it, because they photograph all of these. And the interesting part is most of these trees are on private property. Few of them are on public property. And so the challenge becomes, and I don't have access, what I would have to do is, Maryland Big Tree program has connections to the homeowner. They would reach out to the homeowner and say, hey, this gentleman's interested in putting together a documentary on champion trees. Your tree is a tree of interest. He'd be interested in talking to you. And then if they said yes, then I'd be given their contact information. And then I'd have to do a site visit, make them comfortable about what we're doing, look at their tree, take some photographs. And I tried to keep everything really simple because you don't want a huge film crew showing up at somebody's house. So it was really just 3 people. It would be me, the videographer, and the sound man. Just the 3 of us on all of these sort of shoots. And the fascinating part, the most unexpected part of the entire process was the human element that becomes involved. Because these people are really proud of their trees, as they probably should be, right? And they bring in photographs and certificates, because they get certificates, national certificates, indicating they have a champion tree. They might have family photographs, they might have articles, all types of material that you could scan and include and use in your film to bring it to life. And so in the end, when I look at the film, I realize it's really 2 films. It's a film about trees and it's a film about people, and how those 2 sort of interweave. Very unexpected as you're rolling along. Right? And I was telling Jason this earlier. When we started out, the cameraman and the sound man, this is a paid gig for them, so yeah, they're happy to be involved. And at first they're like, so we're doing trees, okay, and you have the challenges of filming trees because, and this is where those homeowners come into play as well, you can't interview a tree. I mean, you can, but it's not going to work out well for you. So you have to figure out, how do I make this visually appealing, because you kind of have a static piece, namely a tree. You need those homeowners. And so the first film session goes well at one house, second one goes well at a second house, and after we do the second one, both the cameraman and the sound man say to me, this is pretty cool, where are we going next? And that's when I knew, okay, we're on to something here, right? So Maryland Big Tree Program, huge connection, because they're connected statewide to the Department of Natural Resources, to all the trees in the state. Took me on a little adventure around the state to look at potential trees. Not every homeowner was interested in being part of it, and I get that. Right? And there are 12 national ones, as I mentioned, here in the state. Didn't want to do all 12 because that might get a little tedious, so we did 7. Right? You can't talk about national champion trees or the Maryland Big Tree Program without mentioning this gentleman, Fred Besley, who was the Maryland's first state forester in the early part of the 1900s up until almost the middle of the 1900s. Hugely instrumental in starting the Maryland Big Tree Program, which became a model for the rest of the nation, and pretty much every state now has a Big Tree Program, cataloging trees. And so he would go around the state advocating for forestry. And one of the things he kept was a scrapbook. And that scrapbook's probably about this big by like this, and probably about this thick. Right? And in his scrapbook, he had newspaper clippings, editorial cartoons, which were pretty good. And he also took a good number of photographs and would have lantern slide presentations. And if you're familiar with a lantern slide, it is essentially 2 plates of glass that either A, they slip a photograph in between the 2 plates of glass, or B, they expose right onto the glass, and you can take those and project them like on the side of a building. So he would have public showings of these champion trees around the state in an attempt to generate interest about these trees. And in the 1920s, I think it was, they had a contest. Getting the public really interested, going out and nominating, if you see a tree, let us know, we'll come out and measure it. So it generated a considerable amount of public interest. And so in addition to talking about trees, you're trying to think about, okay, we can't just go tree, 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 end of documentary. What can we weave in between some of that, right? Well, here's a good example of a side story you can weave in. Right? And good example of his scrapbook, which from that distance you probably can't see, but there's some really nice on the left, really nice editorial cartoons that are there. And then it was just page after page after page of articles, anything that was out there media-wise. Keep in mind this is the 30s and 20s, anything media-wise, photography-wise, associated with maintaining and saving forests, he sort of had in here. And then here's a good example of lantern slides. And all of this material is located in the Maryland State Archives. So that gives you a nice little side adventure as well. Not only are you talking about Fred Besley, but you also get to go down to the Maryland State Archives and weave that into your story as the location for all this material. And both of these lantern slides, they had a huge box of these lantern slides. And they would tell you it's a very sort of precious part of their overall collection at the Maryland State Archives, which is located in Annapolis, by the way. And here's what it looks like, right? So we have 2 representatives from the Maryland State Archives getting ready to look at Fred Besley's scrapbook. And it makes for a nice visual element, particularly, in my opinion, particularly with that background. When we stepped in there, we were like, oh, this will work. Because that's the other thing you're thinking about. Film is obviously a very visual medium, so how is it that you can make any of this visually appealing. Anybody that you're interviewing, right? I mean, think about the shows, the documentaries that you've watched. Anybody that you're interviewing, you have to think about, okay, what can I lay over the top visually? What can I lay over the top? So it's just not a talking head for 3 minutes. Yeah, I certainly want to show him or her talking, but not for 3 minutes. I'll keep the audio, but I want to be able to have some visual elements that I can lay over the top of that. So you're always thinking about that, always thinking about, okay, what can we do here? What can we collect? And that's where, like, documentary filmmaking differs from fiction filmmaking. Fiction, you have your script, and you're just rolling according to your script, and the editor just sort of follows the scenes and the elements. Yeah, there's some tweaking there. Here, things arise totally unexpected. We have an idea when we show up on site what we want to film and how we want to film it, but at the same time, your mind is just constantly rolling about, okay, what else can we film while we're here? Because we don't want to have to come back. What can we film? What did they just mention? Oh, let's film that. And I'll give a clear example of that here momentarily. So you're always sort of thinking about, always doing background research about what kind of images can we drop in here to make this more visually appealing. Because I don't really have a script to go by. I have no idea what these we give them questions, right? But I have no idea what their responses are going to be. It's not like I have a script in front of me like I would if this was a fiction film. So this was a really nice day. And here's a good example of what I just mentioned. How do you bring life to something? One of the trees, the largest remaining American elm in America, is just inside the Baltimore Beltway. And it's large, right? And the interesting part, it has 2 little siblings beside it. And so you think to yourself, how can we make that story interesting? Because the American elm is the iconic tree in America. But we also know by the middle of the 20th century, it was really suffering due to Dutch elm disease. And so how do you tell that story before you pivot to the American elm in Baltimore? We were thinking, and I just Googled, well, there's elm streets in America everywhere, and I'm guessing they had trees lined on, elm trees. So we Google, how many elm streets are there? Well, depending on what source, we went with a government source. There's like 5,300 elm streets in America, right? On the low end. And so then you start thinking, well, there's got to be photographs, some of those historic photographs of those classic elm streets in America. Reached out to Baltimore. We don't really have anything like that. Started poking around, and then it occurs to me, I wonder if there's photographs. So I find this vintage postcard website. And sure enough, you could buy as many Elm Street postcards as you want, right? And I did. So if you want any, let me know. And so then it becomes a matter of, here's how we can start to tell the story of that iconic tree and its presence in the American landscape with elm streets across America. And the one for me that is sort of a personal connection. Upper right, you can't read these. Upper right is Elm Street in Waterville, Maine. That's where my wife is from. And that's where we sort of spent the early part of our married life, if you will. So when I found that postcard on that website, that's in, right? And so all the others, like that one on the right, I think is in Scranton, and the one on the left, I think that's in New York, right? So you just start to show across the country how prolific Elm Street was and how beautiful it was. And then you cut to this, right? Right? And that's the impact you're looking for right there. Right? You tell a little story about Dutch elm disease, and you think, well, how can we visually tell that? I can show you some trees that are struggling from Dutch elm, and I can show you, a leaflet that tells you we need to be treating this. And then we discover these photos. Waukegan, Illinois, there's a street, not Elm Street, but Gillette Avenue, lined with elms in 1962. Fast forward a decade, Dutch elm disease has just decimated it. They're gone. And that's when you say, okay, now we can pivot to our elm tree, just inside the Baltimore Beltway. And when I say just inside, I mean this is a pretty high-end neighborhood, but you can hear the Beltway off in the distance a little bit. And Anita and Chuck Stapleton, very accommodating, very nice property, filming them in their backyard. And the other thing is, because all of these are exterior filming, except for inside the archives office in Maryland, in Annapolis, all of these are exterior, you have your fingers crossed for the weather, right? Because, you know, rain and all over in the summer, you just have your fingers crossed. Fortunately, with the exception of a 95 humid degree day, every day went well. It was really nice. And so this tree and there's the film crew, right? Videographer on the right, sound man on the left, Anita and Chuck in the background, and you get a sense of scale in terms of the size of their tree. And it's an American elm, and you say to yourself, A, how did it survive not being cut down at some point? And B, how did it survive, you know, that, right? And to know that there's two others right around it. And so that is, I think, a great example of how you start to tell a story. So really, my approach was, let's create little mini movies for each of these trees. Here's a mini movie. You know, start with postcards, let's do Dutch elm disease, let's cut to the couple with the American elm. Little mini 4.5-minute movie. And then, once you've created all your other little mini movies associated with all the other trees, and the archives office, and the entomologist that we interview, then you start thinking about, okay, what's the order of all this so this makes sense? How do I start doing this? This is one of my favorite. An English elm in Montgomery County, part of the Montgomery County Park System. Great little story. They were building a little development. It's like a little cul-de-sac, and there's probably 8 homes there. 8 homes on that little cul-de-sac. And right at the entrance is the largest English elm in America. The English tell you it's larger than anything they have, and so they think it's the largest English elm in the world, right? And to save it from development, the 1/4-acre lot was bought and donated to the county. And so the county created Goshen Elm Park. Goshen Street, I believe, is right there. And it's a 1/4-acre park maintained solely for the tree, right? And they have a little marker in the bottom corner. I don't know how well you can see this, but there's 2 gentlemen maintaining the tree underneath it, so you get a sense of scale, how this tree is big, right? And so the day we show up to film, you can tell it's a nice day, fingers crossed, great. Across the street, into the cul-de-sac, they're cutting down a tree or doing tree work. And my sound man's just like, nope, not gonna work. So I have to go across the street and say, can you just give us 15 minutes as we're interviewing a representative from Montgomery County Parks, and I'll let you know when that is. They didn't have any problem. So they shut down for 15 minutes, and just as we're getting ready to roll, trash truck rolls in. It's trash day. And so I'm like, is there anybody else that's been invited that we're not aware of? There was an expletive in there too, by the way. And as we're filming, the house that's just adjacent, and in the bottom left, bottom right corner of the bottom left photo, you can see a little fence. The woman who owns that house comes out, curious, what's going on? And we describe the project. She goes, oh, well, that's interesting. When I bought this house, we had to sign an agreement saying that if we build a fence, we have to dig the post hole by hand, no heavy equipment, we can't paint it, we can't stain it, we can't put in a pool. If we put in anything big we can't put in a hot tub. If we put in anything big in the backyard, no equipment, because it could impinge upon the root system of the tree. And I was like, that's pretty fascinating. Would you be willing to say that on tape? Yeah, can I go in and freshen up? Whatever you got to do. Right? And so, totally unexpected element of the project. And she adds a great element to that little mini film you're creating about the English elm. Great little story. because you go back and forth between the rep from the county, a gentleman named Coulter Burks, and her, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back. So again, a nice little unexpected element. And then you turn to the impact. I mean, you could talk about climate change, and that was on our list, but we never really got around to that. This is a 60-minute project, by the way. And at first you're like, wow, how are we going to fill 60 minutes? And then at the end you're like, whoa, we have too much here, which is a good problem to have. So one of the things we wanted to talk about was the impact that invasive insects potentially have. And I don't know, is Steve Allgeier here? Many of you probably know Steve. Steve turned me on to an entomologist, a gentleman named Michael Ropp, who is professor emeritus from the University of Maryland, and he is known as Mr. Bug. And if you Google him, he's heavily used in the media to talk about invasive insects. And so he rolls through small bark beetle, the damage it did in terms of Dutch elm disease, spotted lanternfly, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with by now, the emerald ash borer, which I'll mention a little more here in a second, and then, oh, what a great name, the zigzag sawfly. I mean, if you're going to be a villain, you need a name like that. Right? And so we have Michael Ropp, the entomologist, talking about their impact and what they do to trees, whether it's chestnut blight, whether it is Dutch elm disease, whether it is the rise of beech leaf disease, whether it is another defoliator, and this is where the zigzag sawfly comes in, and you can sort of see where it gets its name with that little pattern on the leaf. Just does a zigzag eating of the leaf. Or if you have what's called crepe myrtle bark scale. So he kind of talks about all that stuff. And what's great is a lot of people have these types of trees in their yard, so it kind of connects the viewer to that a little bit. But the really interesting part, for me anyway, is it allows me to talk about this. The largest green ash in America was felled by an invasive species, the emerald ash borer. And so people are like, well, why are you filming a dead tree? And my response is, well, that's the story, right? You have a national champion that's been felled by an invasive species. And so we show up, and this is in Perryville, and you can sort of see it's a pretty good sized tree. We filmed this in June, I think it was, and then 4 months later I get a phone call that a large chunk of it, there on the right, has fallen. Would you like to come out and film that? We'll be right out. So we filmed them sort of, getting rid of this huge chunk of a huge tree that fell into the yard. And so that little mini film, the lead into that is the entomologist who talks about these invasive species, invasive insects, and then you cut to this tree that, that's in your front yard. That's huge. And it's a nice little story in a sad way, if you will. We also did, we became intrigued with a tree tour. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Hampton National Historic Site over in Towson. If you've never been there, highly recommended. They have a pretty good assortment of trees. At one point in time, Hampton was the largest private property in America, 25,000 acres. I think today it's down to about 60-something, 63, I think. So it was gargantuan. And it was a plantation, so it has that history. And the homeowners also had an interest in planting various trees. Cedar of Lebanon, not a common tree here in Maryland. A massive cedar of Lebanon, upper right, that they brought back in a shoebox, a seedling in a shoebox in the 1800s, planted it in the yard. And so we became intrigued with, okay, so many of these trees that we're highlighting are on private property. How, except for the English elm, it's in that small park in Montgomery County, how can we show that these are accessible to the viewer? Well, let's highlight a tree tour that was put together by the Natural History Society of Maryland, where they had a tree tour of various trees at Hampton. And the Park Service granted us permission to do that, and they provided us with some really nice visual imagery as well, because the lead up to this is you're telling the little history of Hampton, visually with archival material and photographs, and then you cut to the tree tour. And you have them pointing out the impact of various trees, including the one in the bottom left, which looks like something out of a cartoon to me. Little sign says, please do not climb on the trees, if you can't read that. And so that's a nice little element woven in between these trees that you're talking about. So you have the entomologist, you have the archives office, and you have a tree tour. And we actually use the entomologist 3 times, weave him in 3 times. That was a good day. Here we have it, right? The local connection. The largest black mulberry in North America is right across town on Gist Road. And scale, look at the size of the trunk of that tree with the homeowner. And there's a little sign that's been there probably since the 70s out front. And the interesting part about this, because I really wanted to do this tree because it's local connection. The family, young couple, they have a child with special needs, and so we kind of had a little bit of a back and forth. You know, their responses would be delayed to emails, and I just did not get the sense that this was going to work out. And it was kind of, you know, honestly bumming me out. And, you know, I didn't want to push, and we talked for probably 6 months as we're trying to decide whether they want to be part of this or not. And the day, and we wanted to schedule it, the same day we're scheduling the tree measuring at McDaniel, images I showed you earlier. And we can knock out both of those, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. And so I'm talking to Gary Schwemmer, the gentleman who measured the trees, and I'm telling him, yeah, I'm trying to decide when we would have you, whether it's in the morning or afternoon, but you might be the only filming we do that day because the tree I'm wanting to film, I'm not certain it's going to happen for us. And he says, well, what tree is that? And I said, well, it's a black mulberry across town. He goes, oh, you mean Alex and Frank Strack? And I'm like, yeah. He goes, oh, they're friends of mine. I know them. He said, let me reach out to them. 3 days later, everything's set up. And so that connection to Gary, who had a connection to them, sort of laid the groundwork for us being able to go out, and a great filming day that day. And then that was in the morning, and in the afternoon we did tree measure. That was a long day here in town. But without me mentioning that to Gary or Gary being connected, this part probably doesn't happen. And to me, it's, you know, this kicks off the film. This tree kicks off the film. And so without that, you probably would have had to pivot to another tree or some other aspect. And for me, it was important because it's connected to us here that live in Westminster. And that tree is huge. The largest Kentucky coffee tree, bizarre, right? I mean, a tree with the name Kentucky, the largest one is in Maryland, go figure. And the gentleman who owns this tree, he's very much into growing flowers, roses and dahlias. And he shows his dahlias in the fall. He goes to showings. And he's also very, very, very proud of his Kentucky coffee tree. And so the day we were there, and this was the most challenging one to edit because there wasn't a lot of supplementary photography or archival material that we had to work with. You know, the black mulberry tree that I just talked about here in town, the Historical Society provided archival images of the property back in the day. So we're able to use some of that as we're telling that story. Here, this was the most challenging part as the editor, to edit this project, because they didn't have as much to work with. Until he mentioned a story about, his was number 2. The largest one was actually down the street, and it got felled by Hurricane Irene in, 2011, I think. And that's when I said, oh, here we go. So then you start finding images associated with Hurricane Irene, do the classic, shot from space, huge swirling over Maryland. And then you start to show the damage that the hurricane did. So there's a little bit of visual elements in there. He's on screen probably more so than any other person that we interviewed. But as soon as he mentioned that, that gave us ideas about visual aspects that we could start to include. Let's look for material associated with the hurricane. And actually, just a back step, the English elm, the woman, the neighbor, or the homeowner that lived next to the English elm, when we were interviewing her, she mentioned the tree roots, and she mentioned the name of her street, Rock Elm Way, and how, because they thought it was a rock elm as opposed to an English elm, the developer, and he wanted to have them change the name of the street about a year in, and all the neighbors were like, no, we're not doing that. So it retained rock elm. So when we were editing, we realized, oh, how come we didn't pick up on that when we were interviewing her? Let's go down and get a shot just of tree roots, and let's get a shot of the street sign, so you can lay that over. Well, so you drive an hour down just to take 4 photographs and drive an hour home. Right? And oddly, there are no visible tree roots, so that's out. So we took photos of the fence because their property's close. The street sign was pretty easy to do. But those are the things you sort of think about from a visual perspective. Oh, we can make that visual. We can have her still saying the story about Rock Elm Way versus English Elm Way, and then boom, put the street sign over the top of that as she's talking about it. And so this was the biggest challenge. Sleight of hand trick, right? The largest button bush in America, and is 17 feet tall. So sleight of hand because all the trees to this point, you're doing this. You're looking up at them like this. Wow. This one, you're kind of looking straight at it, right? And for scale, there's my cameo. For scale, there it is. Right? And so this gives you the opportunity to get into that debate between how do they delineate what a tree is versus what a bush is. And the person we're interviewing, who's associated with Woodland Sanctuary, he gets into that. Where do you draw the line between tree and shrub? So this to me was a nice little funny sleight of hand pivot, if you will, as you start talking about a tree that's, comparatively speaking to all the others you've been talking about, diminutive in size. Tops out at 17 feet. And if you've never been to Woodland Sanctuary, highly recommend it. It's a very nice space. On the left are the types of flowers that it spits out. And then, not a national champion, but a great story. This is a white oak. So it is, I think it's just a county champion. It's not even the largest white oak in the state. And we were debating that because it's not a national champion. All other 6 trees, national champions. This is a county champion. But the story that this gentleman could tell and the connection to the community that the tree had. That they have concerts under the tree. People have been married under the tree. There's a queen of the Travilla oak, right? Ceremonies they have. They've had festivals under the tree and in the parking lot. Because you can't see it, but from the back of you in that photograph is a small little commercial development property. Probably 6 little businesses right there. Little mini strip mall, if you will. And as he says, there are people that pull in here every day without even realizing what's here. And they had to build the fence around it because the utility trucks in the area at lunchtime, they would show up and eat their lunch and park the trucks underneath the tree. So they had to build a little fence, and you can't really see it, but they also built a nice patio with benches underneath there. And this tree has its own Wikipedia page. So you're able to weave that in, right? So story-wise, this tree is like a celebrity, and you flesh that out as you're presenting it. Even though it's just a county champion, and the fact that the white oak is designated as the Maryland state tree. So you kind of weave in that little aspect as well. So story-wise, this probably was my favorite story because he had all kinds of photographs that we could work with. From those festivals, from those concerts, from you name it, he had it. Really, really nice guy. And you get a sense of scale here. That's a good sized trunk. How many of you have ever been to Glenstone? All right, this is like a quarter of a mile from Glenstone. You drive right by it on the way to Glenstone. And I've been to Glenstone a number of times without realizing this tree was there until I was there this summer. And this was the 95-degree day. Right? So that was a bit much. And then lastly, we kind of ended it with the film with a little bit of a montage to the connection between people and trees. In the sense that tried to, because we really kind of wanted to do the state, but that gets hard. So each of these trees are represented by counties in the Panhandle, on the Eastern Shore, on the Southern Shore. So you started, we decided to end the film with like a montage of, I don't know, there must be 12 different trees rolling across, showing you. And as part of that, you get a sense of not just the trees, but also that human connection as well. The one that intrigues me the most, bottom row, you see the big pine tree on the left. The next one over is hard to see. See the gentleman in white? There's actually a guy standing in the center of the tree there. That's how large that tree is. So we kind of end with that montage of trees and people and the connection that we all have to sort of nature, if you will. And then lastly, a tree that didn't make the cut. How many of you are familiar with Growls Market in Baltimore? All right. Another nice little market. Right? Growls is on Bologna Avenue, and probably, 100 yards from Growls Market is this tree, the largest southern catalpa in America. And you get a sense, bottom right, their lawn goes up and the house is up here on a little rise. And if you're taking this photo, behind you is Bologna. And the interesting part is the other side of Bologna are the tracks for the light rail system. So there are countless people every day, whether you're on Bologna or whether you're on the light rail, whizzing by this tree, probably not even realizing what is right there in front of them in terms of, the largest, in this case, southern catalpa in America. It was on our list. It got usurped by the white oak that I just talked about. Although this would have been a great addition, because you could then, just show like how the inner city is like right there in this tree, and the degree to which people, everyday life is. And perhaps even more interesting, this is probably, as the crow flies, probably a mile, maybe a mile and a half at most from the American elm that I showed you earlier, which would, so you've been able to weave that in a little bit, how these two are so national champs are that close to each other. So it didn't make the cut. The more I think about it, that would have been a nice element, but at the same time, I really like the white oak story. Right? And I think that's it. Right? So this was from start of idea. I pitched this to Maryland Public Television. I want to say that was November of 2023. And then January-ish, February, March of 24, really started to get serious about it. Visited people, if you're interested in the timeline, visited the homeowners in April and May, filmed June, July. I think we did a little bit of August, and then again in October of 24. And then we waited. The tree tour was I think that was the end of April of this year, 25. And then the white oak we did in July of 25. So really filming didn't finish until July, and then it's just crazy editing because you have a deadline, airing this Saturday, but NPT needs it a lot sooner. You can't show up Friday. Here's our film. They have a much sooner deadline than that. And so really editing all of July, August, September, graphics, have a graphics gentleman come in, then you send the film out for sound mixing. so that all the sound is evened out, any special effects sound-wise that get included. He did a really good job. And then the last element is you send the entire, and interesting, the sound mixer lives in Waco, Texas. So you are sending him audio files. That's all he needs to work with. And like a Vimeo copy, a MP4 version of the film, so he can line up to see stuff, right? The color correction, who corrects all of the color, because sometimes, you're shooting outside, it's what we call a little hot, it's a little too bright, right? If you're into photography, you know that, right? It's just too bright. So he color corrects all of that. He adjusts color in some other aspects so that it meets broadcast standards. He gets the entire film. And so this project is 2 terabytes. So you ship him a 2 terabyte hard drive. He lives in Connecticut. And so he does all his work in Connecticut. And when he's finished, you're essentially done. And you pass it on to Maryland Public Television, let them make comments, changes they may request, which are a few minor issues. And then, finally, you can say it's a wrap. Right. And it is. And so I'm really pleased, but I'm more pleased for the people that are involved in it. I'm not a big self-promoter, generally speaking. I'm more happy that the people that are involved are happy. I think the homeowners that are involved are really excited to see themselves on TV on Saturday. Department of Natural Resources, I've already screened it for them down at their headquarters in Annapolis. They were very excited. The tree tour group, I have a screening for them coming up. So it's just that level of excitement that is satisfying, on so many levels. And then toss this invitation, and it makes me chuckle because I'm looking at Lynn Wheeler. Lynn contacted me last November. Hey, we'd like to hear about your tree. Yeah, when would you want to do that? How about November of 25? And I'm like, November of 25, right? Okay, well, here we are, November of 25. Just like that. So thank you, Lynn, for the invitation. Thank you.
We have microphones for any questions.
Sure.
I had could you tell us, coming up, what would be the easiest way for people to be able to see the film?
So this Saturday, I don't know what town you live in, so I don't know what MPT station would be Saturday at 8 p.m. And then, as I said, if you're a night owl or have insomnia, 12 a.m. and 3 a.m. Their agreement with them is a 2-year run, so they have free reign of it for 2 years. I don't know when the next airing would be. I can provide, if you're interested, I could provide a Vimeo link. I think I have to wait for it to air on Saturday. I could provide a Vimeo link to you, password protected, and you could bring it up on any computer. If that interests you.
Or contact you about potential screening.
Oh, yeah. We could do that, definitely.
Maybe
Sure.
the historical side.
Yeah. Just to let you know, I have probably seen this film easily 50, 60, 70 times. Easily.
We got a question.
Yeah, just wonder if they'll add it on NPT passport.
I think they will.
Oh, that would be great.
I think they will. Good question, right? I think they will.
Hey, Robert?
Oh, I'm sorry, Steve.
Sorry. You should also mention that your wife is the neighbor.
Oh, thank
and
you.
she provides the soundtrack, doesn't she?
Thank you.
I'll tell her that you mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. The doghouse wouldn't be large enough, right? Yes, she had narrated a previous project that I did. She did a really good job on that, so I sort of talked her into doing this. And then she plays the flute along with a gentleman named Michael Vidmar, and Mike is a guitarist. And talked to Mike because he dabbles in sound mixing music as well. So I talked Mike into creating a little bit of a soundtrack for this. Thank you, Steve. They did a really good job.
So I just wanted to give you a shout out. I saw your talk at Flickwood.
Oh, yeah.
And I gotta be honest, I debated about whether I should come today. But this is a whole different aspect. And just like you said, you've seen the movie 50 or 60 times. This is the second talk I've heard, and I would come to another, because that one was really geared to the technology of the editing and everything.
Right.
But it's just fascinating, and I'm very excited about watching it on Saturday.
To your point about Flick had invited me to come in, and Flick, if you're not familiar, film lovers in Carroll County, they select the films, some of the films that play at the Arts Council. They had invited me in like January or February of this year to come and talk about films. And I had no idea what I was going to talk about. And that was in June? Yeah, that was June. Right? And so one day I'm editing and I say, I'm going to bring in my project. And let's just talk about the filmmaking process, right? And so I just brought in my equipment, the hard drive, the laptop, put it up on a big screen, show the software, here's the decision-making points, here's the footage, here's gaps I have, here's just sort of, here's what's going on behind the curtain, essentially, right? And that was the most pivotal part of this entire process. And I've told Frank Baylor this, because when you're editing by yourself, you have, aside from dragging Debbie in, what do you think of this, right? And you can only do that so many times. When you're by yourself, you get lost and you kind of lose a little feel for what's going on. So the day I went into Flick for that presentation, I showed you guys the American Elm segment, postcards, Dutch elm disease, tree, so forth, 5-minute segment. And when we were done, I said, I can show you another one if you're interested. Yeah, let's watch another one. So I showed the one across town, right, if I recall correctly. And the reaction from the Flick group is sort of what really kept me going, I would say, through the editing process, because you really kind of start to lose it a little bit, because you've just seen it so many times. So when I walked away from that evening, I was so glad that A, I'd been invited, and B, that I'd brought in the project, and the reaction from whatever, a dozen people that are in that room who were very intrigued with the story and the process, that was gold. It really, really was gold.
Obviously, it piqued my interest.
Thank you.
Here you go, Robert, right here on this side. On this side.
I was wondering if you knew the process to kind of bring a tree to someone's attention, if you
Sure.
knew of a tree.
Sure. The Maryland Big Tree Program, their website, they have a nomination form on the website. My understanding is you fill that out, and I assure you, they are fervent about measuring trees. They will come out and measure the tree. They love doing that. So, and that's true of anybody. If you have a tree in your yard or a neighbor's yard or wherever you think would be worthy of county, state, or national champion status, they have a form, and I think the DNR website also has the form. And by the way, this is the 100th anniversary of the Big Tree Program, so they're very sort of proud of that as well. You complete the form, and they'll look into it without question.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.